And we are live. Dr. Subhash Kak, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for doing this again.
Thank you, Abhijit. Looking forward to the conversation.
Right. So we're going to talk about a number of things. The research that you've been doing recently. So the past year and a half or so, you've published a lot of papers. I have that on the screen right now. Uh, a bunch of papers about e-dimensionality, e-dimensional theory of the universe, and also papers about consciousness, machine consciousness, AI, that thing, and also work on Vedanta as well. So the number of papers you published, it reminds me kind of in a sense of the year 1905, Einstein's miracle year. So it's really great to see this incredible outburst of creativity, this incredible output. So that's what we will discuss today. So first of all, you have a number of papers on the e-dimensional theory of the universe, e-dimensionality. So for the longest time, physicists have been looking for extra dimensions. So about a century ago, Kaluza and Klein came up with their five-dimensional theory, the unified theory of gravitation and electromagnetism. Then with the emergence of string theory, we've been looking for 10 dimensions, 11 dimensions, 26 dimensions. And now you have shown that the ideal or optimum number of dimensions in the universe is a non-integer number, E Euler's number, which is an irrational number, one of the most important numbers in mathematics. And you have shown that it resolves a number of problems in physics. So can we start with that? Could you explain what this theory is about, and how did you? What was the thought process that made you discover this?
Thank you. Very interesting question. The idea of three dimensionality is a convention. That we have three dimensions is not proven by any experimentation. It's a convention, and then we fit the data to this frame. And this convention goes back to Descartes, a few centuries ago. Now, within the Indian tradition, Dick and Carl are also supposed to be a product of the mind, which means the number of dimensions it was understood is a product of the mind. But this is, of course, just the background. Now, the whole story of how I came by this discovery, because there is a mathematical theorem which says that the optimal number of coordinates, so to speak, to fit data is E. It's not 3, it's E. And this mathematical theorem has been known not for E, but the fact that 3 is better than 2 has been known for many years, for about 50 years. And actually, about 50 years ago, people even tried to build computers based on gates which did ternary logic rather than binary logic, because these computer scientists knew that ternary is superior to binary. But then by that time, the underlying electronics had already taken a certain direction, and binary gates had gotten established. So it becomes much more expensive to do ternary gates, even though they are superior. But I don't think anybody had really noticed that that it's e-dimensionality which is optimal. And the personal story is this: about 4 or 5 years ago, I heard out of the blue from a very well-established academic community. It's called multiple valued logic community. These are well-known, well-established people in mathematics and computer science. And they wrote to me, they said, "We are having our annual convention in Austria, and would you give a keynote address?" So I said, fine. I had been to Austria, but I hadn't explored it as well as I wanted to. So I leapt at this opportunity. But then I said, well, I must explore what is it that multiple valued logic people do. So I gave a presentation on my work on neural networks, etc. And it was while I was exploring that I discovered the fact that ternary logic is superior to binary logic. I wasn't aware of it myself until 4 or 5 years ago. And then I pushed at this further and then realized that really the optimal is e-dimensionality, and it's a mathematical theorem. And I wrote a few papers, and 2020 was when COVID was getting big and people were frightened and the whole country was shut down. And I was stuck in Miami, which is where my children live. And so I sort of, there was not much to do. So I was sort of thinking about this and that. And suddenly the idea came to me that, look, really, if one were to cross this block that we have in our mind, that things are three-dimensional, let's just push this idea of e-dimensionality to the extent we can. And suddenly a lot of results came out. They came tumbling out. And the very first thing that I was able to discover, and on which I then in 2020 fall, I published a paper, was one of the biggest crises of modern cosmology, which is that the rate at which the universe is expanding, which is called the Hubble Raid, is two different values based on how you measure it. If you measure it based on the microwave background radiation, it comes out a certain value. If you measure it by looking at what are called candles, which are these stars, because things are replicated in the universe, in the cosmos. So you can look at different kinds of stars and see how much they have separated across time, and you come out with another figure, and they have not been able to resolve it over the past 30-40 years. The moment you assume that optimal dimensionality is E, these two figures become one. So this is something that I published a paper on in October or November of 2020 in Nature's Scientific Reports. And then I pushed this further. Well, if e-dimensionality is optimal, then, just as if things were not one-dimensional, they were less than one-dimensional, things will tend to come closer to each other. So likewise, if you can look at e-dimensionality in three different directions, right? In different directions. You have objects in an e-dimensional universe, because it's not integer, it is non non-integer dimensionality. Then objects will tend to come close to together, and that should be the explanation for gravitation. And the consequence of that is that the relationship is indeed quadratic in the denomination, which is what the central idea of gravitation theory is. Newton's laws, Newton's gravitation theory, proportional to 1 over r square, and likewise Einstein's, which is the same in a three-dimensional frame, excepting that mass causes space-time to curve, right? And I published another paper on it, which I think is very important, because if you look at physics over the last 30, 40, 50 years, there has been this great effort to bring all the forces together, and electromagnetic and the weak force have been put together as the electro-weak force. Then you have the strong force. But in spite of all the efforts, gravitation has not been fitted into it. So gravitation, people have tried, like Abhay Ashtekar and many others, loop gravity theory, but they've been totally unable to do it. This provides you an explanation that, look, gravitation is a different kind. Its source is different. Its source is the very nature of space, right? And so I published on that, and this resolves another problem related to, now that 25 years ago they discovered that the expansion of the universe is accelerating, right? And therefore this means that the whole universe will keep on accelerating, and there will be a cold death. All the stars will expend their energy, and on logical grounds that doesn't seem reasonable at all, right? So what is the meaning of the universe? What is the meaning of reality? Using my explanation, e-dimensionality explanation, what you conclude is that, well, it is indeed accelerating, and this acceleration started about 5-6 billion years ago. But as the dimensionality increases further, the rate of acceleration will drop, and then eventually things will come back together. I think it's a beautiful resolution of this idea. Now, beyond this, this has been such an amazing thing, because nobody had ever thought of it. It's like results are there for the pickings. It's like what happened in the late 1920s or 30s, when the quantum mechanics framework come along. Any paper that you wrote was something new. There were so many groundbreaking works done by so many different people, which is, of course, also the idea that what anybody does is really the most obvious thing to do. We normally assign, hey, this guy did something great. Well, it was the most obvious thing to say at that particular moment if they had only recognized and seen things for what they are. So, to add to the story, if e-dimensionality is optimal, then it should also apply to the DNA, because
Mhm.
DNA is also the structure in some abstract space. And indeed, a lot of the stuff about the DNA and about the secretome, etc., also fit into that model. And I published some paper on that also, and there are others which are in the preprint servers. There's a lot of other stuff that is coming along, which is in the pipeline. So it's been the most amazing thing, and of course the other side is consciousness, etc. Perhaps we want to discuss that in another segment.
Yes. So you've also shown that the fractional dimensionality affects the large scale structure of the universe, the small scale structure of matter, subatomic particles, the structure of space time itself. You've spoken about the spiral and disk galaxies in the very early universe. You've shown that the e-dimensionality explains that as well. That, I mean, recently we are finding evidence of very early galaxies that are spiral in nature, disk shaped galaxies. So that's also being explained by e-dimensionality, right?
Right. The standard model in cosmology is that you had the Big Bang. You had
Mhm.
gases. Firstly in the initial phase, you had all radiation, and then you had gases, and then slowly it started accumulating. And firstly, these blobs appeared, and then finally, spiral galaxies came along much later. After many billion years. And now the findings are that in reality, spiral galaxies, there are at least some examples which arose very, very early on. And
Yeah.
now, something very common about a lot of spiral galaxies is that they have a barred structure in the middle. So there are all of these stars in a line, so to speak. And at the edges of these are the spirals, right? Now, in fact, the Milky Way is a barred galaxy also, right in the middle of it. And of course, as we know, the sun is in one of the spirals. Now, the if okay, I didn't touch upon it. The idea, and this is totally consistent with Vedanta. And this is the other thing. Maybe I didn't quite mention it. I've been into Vedanta and the whole the Vedic understanding for many, many years. I've written books in the 90s itself, the astronomical code of the Rig Veda, and this and that, and in Vedanta. And we have descriptions of it in many texts, including the Mahabharata and the Yoga Vasishta, etc. That look, in the creation phase, the creation begins with with consciousness. You can call it you know Chaitana or whatever. Consciousness is the fundamental stuff of reality. From there arises Akasha. From Akasha arises Vayu, then Tejas, then Apaha, and then finally Prithvi. This is the sequence that everything arises out of consciousness. And that's also a very interesting question from a physics perspective. If consciousness is apart from material matter, then how can they interact, right? Two unrelated things can't interact. And there, there you have a very interesting idea, which was proposed by this great Indian physicist from Kerala, George Sudarshan, in the 70s. He said, look, because in quantum mechanics there's a collapse of the wave function. If you keep on, and that collapse is because of observation, right? The observer is interacting with the apparatus. So if you keep on observing in a particular way, you can actually steer the state of the function. So this is how consciousness and matter interact. Now, this, of course, those amazing things about India. These things had already been discussed many centuries ago in the Indian tradition, because in the Indian tradition, the Vedas say everything is by law, ritam. Rit means law, from where the word ritu also comes, seasons. Everything in material universe is by natural law. But then where does the deity come in? Right? How does creation take place? If everything is material, then there should be no place for anything non-material. But the deity, consciousness is non-material. In fact, that's what the Brahma Sutras all talk about. All of the Upanishads are about the idea that the Atman is beyond materiality. You have avidya and vidya. Avidya is about materiality, vidya is about non-materiality. So the idea came along as a resolution amongst circles where these things were discussed. The resolution was that creation is done through drishti. It's the drishti, which is the observation of the deity, which does srishti. So it's called drishti srishti vad, right? And so all of this has been a part of it, that in pralaya also, what will happen, the sequence will be reversed. And there is a episode in the Mahabharata, and I've quoted that in my papers, early papers, that the whole sun will become bigger and bigger, and it will absorb the earth. Then everything will become liquid of fire, liquid fire. So that is the apaha. Then everything will be radiation, which is tejas. Then there will be a wind, which is vayu. And then this wind will be absorbed in akash. And then it will all become a part of this transcendent consciousness. Okay. Now, with this as background, if and this is perfectly, as I said, consistent with Vedanta, if creation is also creation of dimensionality, then you don't jump from 0 to 3 in one jump, one leap. So 0 will slowly increase to 1 to 2, and then it'll keep on increasing until we hit E, right? So that's what the sequence would be, which means that initially you will have one or less than one dimensional structures. So one-dimensional structures will form before two-dimensional structures. And these one-dimensional structures would then be the heart of larger two-dimensional structures. These spirals are also fundamentally two-dimensional, right? They're not globular. So therefore, one-dimensional structures, barred galaxies, and spiral galaxies, because once you have a bar, and then because of symmetry breaking, this bar will start rotating one way or the other. So barred and spiral galaxies should arise right at the beginning of the evolution of the cosmos, which is consistent with new observations and totally opposite to what has been assumed to be the process by which the cosmos has grown. So it does solve that problem also. And so that's sort of very satisfying. And we just published with a colleague of mine, published a longish paper on this. But there are many, as I said, wherever, if you take the idea of e-dimensionality, wherever you look, because the universe in one sense is information. And that is, after all, again, what is Vedanta? All of these things come together. The universe resides in our minds, in our consciousness, right? So everything is information. And if information is e-dimensional, wherever you look around you, fractality, structures repeating themselves at the cosmic scale or on terrestrial phenomena, they will have similar forms. And not only that, the whole universe, the Pind and Brahmand equivalence, the whole Brahmand is mirrored in a metaphorical, abstract sense within our own Pind, within our own structure. So all these structures also help us understand our own self, the architecture of our own mind. And these things, once again, are a part of our deep tradition, like Sri Vidya. You have Sri Vidya, which is the very architecture of the mind. That uh, you have the three layers of outer reality, you know, um, which is which you can either view it as the sun, the atmosphere, and the earth. Right, that is one way of looking at it, and or the other way looking at it is the body, the pranas, and lamp of consciousness. Right, or another way of looking at it is the the base, which is creative or generative, then the supportive. The base is below the navel, the supportive is between the navel and the head. The supportive and head is the third one, and these are three layers which were represented. And the secret knowledge, as the base is the Brahma Granthi, the center is the Vishnu Granthi, the top is the Rudra Granthi. So these are, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. You discover the whole world's unraveling. And all of these worlds are a part of the esoteric knowledge, the secret knowledge, the yogic knowledge, which is lived, Hindu tradition. So amazing stuff. All I can say, it's so extraordinary, it's so mind blowing that it's incredible.
Some further questions about this. Is the e-dimensional structure, nature of the universe, responsible for the expansion of the universe? And what are the implications of e-dimensionality for dark matter and dark energy?
Okay, good questions about the cosmos. Um, as the as dimensionality goes from 0 to 1 to 2, so there is this expansion, right?
Mhm.
and and it's the relative balance between this expansive force. You can assume there is a potential, they if you wanted to use esoteric terminology, the will of the cosmos related to the consciousness creating, embodying itself into the physical cosmos. That is a potential, if you want to express it in mathematical terms. Now, that potential goes against this gravitational force which arises because of non integer dimensionality, right? And this gravitation force is a maximum at 2.5 or 1.5. 2.5 is, because at 2 there is no gravitation. At integer dimensionality there is no force. The force arises because of non-integer, the most non-integer dimensionality that you can have, which is 2.5. So that's when the gravitation force started started lessening from 2.5 on to, we are maybe around 2.6, 2.7 or so. As it started lessening, the potential associated with the expansion became bigger, and that's when the acceleration of the universe began. So you can go back, and in fact, just a couple of months ago I published a paper on this, because it's also related to Dirac's large numbers hypothesis. I published a paper on this also in Indian Journal of Physics, where I speak of some of these numbers. Yeah, so to come back to your question, you don't need dark energy at all. Just look, this is one of the biggest scandals of modern physics. You are forced to postulate 68% of dark energy, 26% of dark matter, which is 95% or 96%, and then 4.5% of interstellar gases. And then you're saying that all of our physics, which is complete now, almost complete, is able to explain only 0.5% of the perceived cosmos. Clearly, that's a scandal. That, because there is not the slightest piece of evidence for either dark matter or dark energy. So, as far as you don't need dark energy anymore to explain why the expansion of the universe has accelerated. So that goes out of the window. And now, as far as dark matter, which is postulated to explain why stars away from their centers in different galaxies are traveling much faster than can be explained by either Newton or Einstein's theory. I haven't worked that out. I'm still, that is something that I'm working on out on. But I think that should also be explainable based on this e-dimensionality of space theory.
Right. Now, how do we incorporate e-dimensionality in physics, in quantum mechanics, in quantum field theory? Could we formulate e-dimensional versions of Maxwell's equations or an e-dimensional version of the Schrodinger equation? Is that something that is possible?
I don't think you would need it. I really don't know all of those questions. We're sort of beginning looking
Hmm.
at all of this. I don't know whether we even need it, because when you're talking of Schrodinger's equation, for example, we're not invoking dimensionality there, because you can look at quantum mechanics as in terms of information. You have a system, you're observing it, and you're talking of the evolution of that system. So we're not talking of what the dimensionality is. But perhaps when you're looking at a quantum mechanical system in an e-dimensional space, as to what implications that might have, maybe you may have to look at that anew in some sense. But I think fundamentally it doesn't change any of that, fundamentally, because these are all theories of information. Everything in physics is ultimately about information. You have a setting, and in that setting you interact with the system and you obtain certain information, right? But certainly in certain cases, for example, you're talking of hydrodynamics, right? Why do we have eddies, or why do we have certain aspects related to the way the system evolves? That's where dimensionality comes in, absolutely, right? Wherever there is flow, the
Hmm.
moment you're talking of flow, if you're talking only of information, I don't think it changes anything at all. But if you're talking of accumulation of matter and flow, then it does matter. It would have implications of it. And certainly that would need to be investigated. In fact, something I just did just last week, and now it's with a journal, I looked at the question of fractals. You have the famous Cantor set. You have a line, it divides into three, and then you leave out the middles, and then it goes further and further, and its dimensionality is 0.69, which is less than one third of E, which is 0.90. So what kind of fractals would you need which would have dimensionality which is equal to 0.90, along one of the three perceived directions? I must also add that even in an e-dimensional universe, we will perceive it through our minds in a three-dimensional frame, right? Because everything, the physical reality, is ultimately mapped into our knowledge in a three-dimensional frame. So we will certainly do that, right? So these theories ultimately are true, uh, related to how consciousness illuminates our minds. Consciousness is, of course, extra mind, and as you are aware, I have argued in recent papers in this amazing year. I've argued that consciousness cannot be material. uh, Computers will never be conscious. So, which is exactly the same argument as in the Brahma Sutras. You read the Brahma Sutras, or read the Upanishads. If you just, rather than go through Sanskrit, you just want to write that in one line, or the Bhagavad Gita. What's that line? The line is that Atman is not physical. Atman is beyond the Pancha Mahabhutas, right? So Atman meaning consciousness, right? Atman is consciousness. So consciousness is non-physical, right? And so it cannot be derived logically using any argumentations related to properties of matter, because consciousness is not a property of matter. Consciousness is the capacity which allows you to see matter. It's the other side of the coin. If matter is one side of the coin, consciousness is the other side of the coin. And as you know, which sadly not as many people know now as ought to have been the case, Schrodinger himself was inspired by Vedanta, and he got it. If you read his book, What is Life, which was also of great importance in setting forth the biology revolution, because Francis Crick was himself inspired by What is Life by Schrodinger. And Schrodinger says, the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, is really the heart which explains things. I am Atma Brahman, that this observer itself is consciousness, which is perceiving the physical reality, and this is always apart from the physical reality. If you go from classical physics to quantum physics, the departure, the leap is classical physics, everything is matter. Quantum mechanics, which is equivalent to Vedanta in all its implications, is that there is a double reality. On one side is matter, the other side is consciousness. And as we also know, it's very amusing from a modern perspective, wokeism or the left is all about everything being material. That's why
Yes.
left is so bitterly opposed to the idea of Atman, which is the very heart of 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 the Vedas, and as I argue, totally consistent with the ideas that we have in the most advanced science.
Right. Now there is the question of time. So in general relativity, we have four dimensions, three dimensions of space and one dimension of time. Is there any way we can throw some light on the mystery of time through the e-dimensionality theory?
Beautiful question. Time is the other side of consciousness. If there was no time, there'll be no consciousness. Consciousness is an awareness of change, right? And as we know, and I like to keep on going back to Indian ideas, to Vedanta, that Shiva, even in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, within everybody's heart, I'm known as Maheshwar, right? Or Shiva, or Ishwar, which is Atman, right? Now, Shiva is consciousness. Shiva is consciousness principle, and Vishnu is the principle of Sat or reality, right? And the third principle related to the goddess is our perception. That is the energy that we have, reality, the prakriti, the nature of us, which helps us get to this consciousness, which is always, it's a principle, it goes beyond, but we see it through its various shadows in our mind. And that's the working of prakriti. So these are three aspects: Vishnu, Shiva, and prakriti, or the goddess, right? Now, Shiva as consciousness does its dance in our minds, in our thoughts, or we can perceive in the very unfolding of the universe. It's the embodiment of consciousness as a dance. Now, it was realized by the rishis that uh, consciousness is time, and therefore Shiva is also Kal or Mahakal, right? You have in Ujjain Mahakaleshwar, right? The famous temple. So the mystery of consciousness is the mystery of time, and and in our perceptions, that's why you have Kali. There are two ways to reach Shiva: is either through consciousness directly, or through reflections on time. Now, let me step back. How does one do the science of it? There are two ways of looking at it in terms of these broad strokes, which we already have in Vedanta. Amazing, extraordinary thing. And it's all universal knowledge. All this attacks or people who don't understand all of this. It's rather so foolish. People who are talking about this, not understanding what it really is. These are not anthropological stories. And how many people like Aurobindo or Kumaraswamy, they all said what's wrong with the so-called academic scholars, that they don't get it. It's about, it's not about anthropology, it's about the very nature of reality. So to come back, how does, can one look at a mathematical framework? Because in one sense what we are trying to do, or what is happening, is making uh, the perceptions or the intuitions of reality that we all possess in one way or the other. And if you are a scientist, you are able to give it an outer form using a language that people can relate to. But poets also get it. They may not know science, or even grandmothers may get it. You know, they get it in an intuitive sense, or a lot of people get it. But the question is, how do we map this mystery of time then into mathematics? And I don't know, maybe these models themselves give us an intuition that time and space are two different aspects, or space time are one aspect of reality perceived in consciousness. Because just imagine, just ask yourself, if the universe is going to, even if you take the idea of dark energy, it's all going to go in cold death, right? The whole, everybody is going to die. There'll be no memory. If we are holding on to our memory and to our follower counts on Twitter or whatever else, all of this is in vain. None of it will survive, right? Or our books that we have written, or the money that we have amassed. You know, that itself is the paradox of existence, right? So in that sense, we do sense it, that really life and death are two aspects of reality. Yama, death, is the complement. Yama means the twin. Time is the twin of what we perceive in outer reality, right? So maybe it is possible that you can only talk about it in poetic terms, as kavi. You know, the rishis were also kavis, so we can speak of it in poetic terms. Or you can also, as the Puranas said, that reality ultimately is just a lila, you know, the game that the gods, the devas, are our senses play. And it's that game that we are a part of. But beyond that, if time itself is fluctuating, then everything goes away. You know, cosmos, reality disappears the moment time stops. And time stops when consciousness withdraws all this at pralaya, if you accept it. Or if you don't want to accept that storyline, if you take the modern cosmology storyline and assume steady state, of course that's not considered mainstream anymore. But let's assume that there is some process by which the accelerating expansion of the universe ceases, and it comes back in, and then it goes back into nothing that it came out of, you know, the Big Bang, which is really consistent with what the Vedantic view is, that it comes out of nothing and then becomes the Panchamahabhutas. So where my story comes in, and a mathematical story, is that before we speak of Panchamahabhutas, let's also speak about Dik, beginning. Before the Bhutas is Dik and Kal. So all of this, Dik meaning directionality or dimensionality. So it's in that Dik that a lot of stuff happens, which is able to reveal to us aspects of reality that we have now observed in the physical cosmos.
Right. And what are the implications of e-dimensional theory to the structure of DNA? You have a paper on that as well, right?
Yes, uh, the in DNA you have the four bases, right? And you, from there you have the code, you have the genetic code, and genetic code has a very interesting structure. You know, if you do, as a information theorist or as a computer scientist, one would know that if you are trying to store information, and you want to have some error correction capability, you know, you have some data points, you would protect each one of those data points in about the same way. Or you can imagine some space in which you have these data points, and you have these little spheres around these data points which provide error correction capability. But you find in the genetic code that's not the case. That there's some of the amino acids have more protection than some others, and it is totally consistent with non-integer dimensionality in exactly the same form as we have in e-dimensionality. So this is what I have a paper which was published a couple of months ago, 3-4 months ago on this. But there are many, not many, a couple of preprint server things which are also going through their peer review process in other journals. Yes, so it is consistent. And what it tells us is that really the idea of e-dimensionality, and I also published a paper on that, showing that this is a general mathematical theorem, that all data is optimally organized in e dimensions. And now you might say, could it have implications to modern society? Yes, if you're looking at health data, and there's also the problems with too much of data that you don't know, it swamps you, you become helpless. But if we were to look for health data or patterns in it from the perspective of e-dimensionality, maybe something will come out of it. Or just look at the whole COVID story, last 2.5 years. You find that the most fatalities have occurred in the countries which spend the most on health, like the United States or Western Europe. Why, one might ask? Because in Western Europe or United States, South America, this is based on allopathy, which is a two-dimensional nature of reality, that you are well or you're not well. If you're not well, we are going to give you a specific chemical, and you are not allowed to take any other specific chemical because you are this object with certain properties, right? Now, in Eastern countries, in India and certainly in Japan or China or Southeast Asia, which is more connected to a non-binary view, because this non-binary view is more intuitive view, that look, I'm not a solid totally separate from everybody else. We are all extended. Our reality is extended. Our health itself is not yes or no. If you're not feeling well, you're living in a village, you go to the Vadya and he'll say, hey, why don't you take this or that? Because you, apart from your body, you also have mind, which allopathy totally dismisses. Of course, they talk about mental diseases, but that's a separate thing to be also treated by chemicals. But in reality, the body is mind and matter complex, right? And so in societies where they said, okay, if you're not feeling well, you do this or that, they looked at health as a spectrum. What is certainly true is that the outcomes have been so far superior. The fatality rate in Japan is 1/10. Certainly in India as well, it's been 1/10, although those who look at reality only through European eyes would respond by saying that we don't accept Indian figures. India is not to be trusted. Okay, you don't trust India. What about Japan? The Japanese are a very meticulous people, right? Their data is to be trusted. How do you explain that the Japanese response, and they're reasonable people, right? But they do also look at the body. This is their old tradition, which has an Indic component, as we know. I'm never tired of telling Indians that the largest number of shrines to Saraswati are in Japan, not in India. The Japanese worship Saraswati, Benzai 10. We have gotten so horribly disconnected through the last couple of 100 years with our own wisdom tradition that it's really sad. But to come back to your question, it has implications much far beyond just the theory related to biology, which is DNA, on which, as I've argued, that we can very easily show, and these numbers are very simple, and you can check out those papers yourself, that they are totally consistent with this idea, which is non-integer dimensionality, and that is then a certain property which replicates itself all around us, terrestrially as well as cosmologically. And I would hope, and all of science is a conversation, and this stuff is out there. I'll hope that people would challenge it and also see if they can take it in different directions, and then benefit from it.
Right. Now let's talk about the other two papers. One is the limits of machine consciousness, and the second one is the number of autonomous cognitive agents in a neural network. So you also have a layperson's account of this on Medium called "The Proof of the Existence of God." So what are these papers about, and how does it prove the existence of God?
Okay. Uh, 4 or 5 years ago, DARPA, which is the body in the United States which funds the most advanced research. In fact, as we know, DARPA was the agency behind the funding of ARPANET and the internet as it eventually came to being. So DARPA decided to ask the question whether computers will eventually become conscious. But it's a very touchy subject because, religious people or churches, etc., will come in. They'll say, why are you thinking of it? So they gave a huge grant to SRI, Stanford Research International, and they said, okay, don't bring our name up, can you set up a team or do whatever is needed to explore this question? So SRI, what they did was they decided to organize 10, 11 week-long workshops. They invited some of the world's leading computer scientists, physicists, neuroscientists, philosophers, and program managers from Washington, D.C., and other people. And they also invited me. They said, would you participate? So I went to a meeting in Cambridge, UK, where there were 30 odd people. And they were not necessarily the same people at all these meetings. And there was once in the Bay Area as well. So the question was, will computers become conscious? Because if computers can become conscious, then clearly, first of all, fundamental implications for it, for science, for philosophy, for religion, for the future of mankind. Because if computers become conscious, and then they will, first of all, they'll say, what are these pesky little creatures called humans? Let's get rid of them, right? Then computers will rule the world, right? And many people believe that computers will become conscious. So in the meeting in Cambridge, UK, as I said, week-long meetings, morning to evening, and we would make presentations and discuss. We had a poll, and about 50% of those at the meeting said, yes, computers will become conscious. And the other 50% said no. The 50% who said yes, then I was chatting with them, I was one of those 50% who said, no, they will never become conscious. But you are chatting, these are pleasant guys, well-known guys in their field. Europeans, I was the only Indian, Europeans and Americans. So they said, at least the ones that I talked to, they said, look, personally, we are in the science framework, but as philosophy, we are attracted to Buddhist ideas that there is really nothing but shunyata, nothingness. So consciousness has come out of nothingness, and so we ultimately believe that once computers are able to emulate more and more aspects of brain functioning, eventually computers themselves will become conscious. The other 50% were physicists or philosophers, more deep philosophers, who recognize that in physics itself, in quantum mechanics, if you're only doing computer science, you think everything is a machine, right? Everything is a program. So the mind is also a program. But if you're doing physics, if you've done quantum mechanics, or if you've done any deep physics, you realize, or if you've done mathematical logic, you realize there are paradoxes. Mathematics itself is full of paradoxes, right? Like the liar's paradox, which is also the Bhartrihari paradox, because Bhartrihari mentioned it many centuries prior to 20th century. So, so then I wrote up an essay on this, the limits of machine consciousness, and then the editor of the Journal of AI and Consciousness, who is from Italy, he says, "Can we publish this in our journal?" So that's where it came about, where I argue from many different grounds, mathematical logic, quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and then personal stories, stories of Ramanujan, for example, who would come up in the morning with a new result, mathematical equation. Can't explain where that equation came from. In fact, all of discovery by anybody, because we are talking about universal things, comes from nowhere. In fact, since you asked me this question, many of the papers that I've written on many different things, on different fields, right? In the last amazing 1.5 years, the whole night I can't sleep, and in the morning I have the answer. I write the paper in just a couple of hours, and these could be things which I have not done before. So they come from somewhere else, which is what consciousness is, not material. So I wrote up on this, and I believe the argument is perfectly logical, and the argument is also this: if you were to look at the brain itself as a computer program, and of course computers can do AI, they can do pattern recognition. So, and they can solve problems faster than us, or they can solve pattern recognition faster than us, as the surveillance state is showing, right? You can recognize faces, you can recognize voices, etc., etc. But the difference between the computer and our mind, our awareness, and our mind also is a computer, is a machine. So the mind is not consciousness. This is a very subtle point, which the Western tradition doesn't quite get it, because in the West, consciousness and mind are conflated. In the Vedanta, consciousness and mind are apart. Mind is a machine which is informed by consciousness. The observer, the one who sees, is always apart from the indriyas, from the eyes. The eyes are separate from the seer. Okay, so what happens in the mind is you are doing an observation, but you can always stop this observation. If the brain itself was the mind, then once you are in a computation, you'll stay in that computation. You will not have the capacity to step away from it, right? Which tells us that the entity which is doing the observation is apart from the process of observation, right? And so this is an argument which can be advanced. Now, the Brahma Sutra argumentation, which is of course the same as the Upanishadic argumentation, or the Bhagavad Gita as the essence of the Upanishads, is exactly the same argument. That look, the observer, the Ishvara, is apart from materiality. The Ishvara is the observer. The observer is always apart from you. So don't despair. Your body may die, but the real you, the observer, will always be alive, because the observer doesn't die. The Atman is not born or does not die. That is the argument, right? So the argument of the impossibility of a machine to become conscious is also the argument of the Ishwar and the immortality of the Atman, right? although that seems to be like a leap, but in reality these are the same argument. So in that popular essay, The Proof of the Existence of God, I sort of quickly gloss over it, that present this gloss, that look, the moment you recognize that the brain is not conscious, brain cannot be conscious, brain can do computations, but brain is not what is doing the observation, then you've learned the Vedas. The Vedas in a line is just this. What has happened in India, very sadly, over the last 70 years, is that we've obscured this all to such an extent that people don't quite understand. They understand it intuitively if you're a part of the life in which you have been raised. Because, I've gone to small villages. I was raised in really small villages. I've studied in village schools on tat, the mats. And I can tell you that there is tremendous wisdom and intuition that people have. This amazing ecosystem within India where you absorb it indirectly, through osmosis. And the people who are separated from it are those who have gone to those Western schools and they don't quite get it. And that's why they hate it so much, which is why there is a kind of a war going on within India, between these two understandings. And the understandings are really, reality has Atman also in it, and the understanding that you are nothing but material bodies, which is that mainstream Western tradition. Okay, so to come back to your question, so this is one part of it. The other part is, okay, now let's look at the brain from a neurophysiological perspective. There are so many neurons, and there is a certain speed of transmission of information. Then, given such mass of the mass of structure, so many, 10 to the power 10 neurons, the activity will not all flow to all corners of the structure at the same time. And what was incredible was, and I was not looking for it, this is one of those things that you wake up in the morning and you know that you have to write it. And as Einstein once said, my pen is smarter than I. You are writing it and all these things flow out of, you're typing it and you're writing stuff and you don't know where it came from. So I looked at these numbers, and out of nowhere came 25. I was not looking for that number. I was just looking at, well, if you have this mass of neurons, how many independent, autonomous computations can occur? Just as in theory of relativity, special theory of relativity, there is a certain past and there is a certain future, but there are other parts of the space-time which are not a part of this past and future. So how many, and this is an argument which had never been made in neuroscience. So computations within the neural structures, how many other autonomous structures would exist? And using e-dimensionality, it turns out to be exactly 25, which incredibly, as we know, is the number of tattvas in Samkhya, which is the very heart of Vedanta. Krishna speaks about Samkhya Yoga as one of the fundamental things. So there are, so totally consistent, incredible. And I was being very playful when I used the word God. I didn't use the word Ishwar. I used the word God because the word God itself has an etymology which comes back to Sanskrit, which very few people are aware of. And I'm aware of it because I've spent many years looking at Khotan, Khotanese language, and Avestan, because, there is a timeline, Sanskrit, Avesta, and then you have Central Asia, Khotan, which was a kind of a extended Indian colony. And you find in Avesta the word for Swatav, Swa meaning one's own, Tav means power. Swatav Mujhko tav chadh gaya. I got into this state of power. Swatav, the word for God is khwatav, and then it becomes khoda in later Middle Persian, and from khoda became got, because you had the Indic and the Iranian people interacting with the Slavs and the Germanic people. It became got, G-O-T-T, and then God in English. So swatav is self-powered, which is Ishvara. This is another word for Ishvara, which people in the Western religious traditions don't know the history of, but they're becoming aware. As you know, so much of funny stuff that goes on in history related to ideas. In the 1970s, in the Garrison state of Pakistan, people realized that Khuda was a Sanskritic word. So at that time, Ziaul Haq said that from now on, we will not say Khuda Hafiz, we'll say Allah Hafiz. Um, Allah protect you rather than Khuda protect you. You know, all of history, it's so much of amusement. You can get a lot of amusement at what people do for what reasons.
Right, indeed. So what you think is that the mind is not the consciousness. The mind is separate from the consciousness. The brain is a machine. It's what you would call an intelligent agent, perhaps. So now the question is this: that when we see consciousness, we can recognize it. We see it immediately. We know it's there, and we have living beings with various degrees or various grades of consciousness: humans, chimpanzees, dogs, cats, horses, cows, ants, bees, all that. The question is, why does consciousness seem to reside in brains, in biological structures? Why not in rocks and pebbles?
Okay, there is a beautiful dialogue between Gargi and Yagyavalkya in Brihad Aranyak Upanishad on this. Beautiful, beautiful dialogue. And the dialogue is, where does Akash reside in relation to Vayu? Where does Vayu reside in relation to Tejas? Are these all separate? All these Mahabhutas separate, right? So the answer that Yagyavalkya gives to Gargi is that they are oth-prot. Oth-prot meaning they are all entangled. So consciousness is entangled with all reality. All phases of matter are entangled with each other. All Mahabhutas are entangled with each other. So consciousness does reside everywhere. It resides everywhere. Now, the way it expresses itself in our minds, for example, our mind is the stuff that is perceived by us based on the activity in the brain. So you do need brain for mind. You cannot have mind without the brain. Okay, so if the brain is damaged because of a stroke or injury, then clearly the mind will become limited in what it can do. The mind may not be able to recognize people, or there's damage, there is the circuits get blocked, so a person may lose the capacity to recognize people that that person knew before. Okay, so likewise animals, their capacity is limited. In fact, what's incredible is beautiful research done in Japan some time ago, and I talked about it in an essay which I just wrote yesterday called The Devi and Planes of Consciousness. And in this research, they showed that chimpanzees have memory far superior to that of human beings. And that brilliant experiment that was devised was to flash 10 numbers, 10 digits, 0 through 9, in sequence, in random sequence, in a fraction of a second. And the chimp was rewarded based on typing the same sequence in the correct order on a screen. And the chimps are able to do it in 1/5 of a second. And no humans can match it. We need some seconds. And most of us, we can probably repeat 5 if you're given 1 second or something for it. So chimps and other animals, they have the same eyesight. They have maybe hearing better than us. We know dogs have hearing better than us. They can taste things as well as we do, right? So what else do we do? We can feel, they can touch. So they have the same indriyas, but they don't have the same access to all the planes of consciousness. So now you might ask, where do these planes of consciousness come from? Because consciousness, prakash, in Kashmir Shaivism, well, in Vedanta, I shouldn't say, there's nothing new in my view in Kashmir Shaivism that doesn't exist in Vedanta in general, right? Shiva is prakash, is light. But this light gets there's a spectrum. It gets broken into different hues, you know, and each of those gives a certain capacity to the mind. So depending upon what light, what aspects of this light are accessible, and this accessibility is sort of developed either through one's own tapas or through education, through sanskaras, and through osmosis, through observation. The greatest teacher is the goddess, which is Prakriti, which is nature, both outside nature and our own nature. The goddess is within us, right? It's not gender to relate it to gender as Western feminists do is totally miss the idea. They don't get it. Which is why feminism has reached this terrible current situation that we find in the West, right? With all this transgenderism, etc. People mutilating their own bodies or bodies of children. So this mind, this light gets into different planes, so to speak. I'm using a metaphor. And now dogs have the same capacity to love as we have. They have the same capacity to feel as we have, or pain and so on. And doctors who treat dogs who've been injured can see that sense of love in their eyes of the dogs, reaching up to the doctor. They know that something beautiful is being done to them, helpful is being done to them. So the planes of consciousness are not all accessible because of the biology, the structure of the brain. And that's why certain animals, even though I would think that other animals also have empathy, as we know, we see the lioness and her cubs, same empathy, right, as that we have. So, but the distinction between consciousness and mind is a very important one. That the mind is a product of the activity in the brain, but it's not consciousness in itself. Consciousness is one. In fact, Schrodinger, in one of his essays, said it very movingly. He said, to say that consciousness is one is blasphemous in the Western tradition. But it's the very heart of the Vedas. It's the very heart of the mystery of reality, that you and I are really the same. Our mind is a mirror on reality. So we are different mirrors, but that reality that we see is one. This is the Veda. If I were to say it in Sanskrit, this would be the Veda. In Mantra
Right.
Pushpam, for example, yes.
Mhm. So you have demonstrated that the number of autonomous agents in a neural network, like the human brain, is 25. Let's say we construct an artificial neural network which has more number of connections, neurons, than the human brain. Would it have more numbers of a greater number of autonomous agents?
No, it won't, because it won't be oath-proth with consciousness.
Mhm.
Let's go back to what Yagyavalkya says, Gargi, and tells to Gargi. The computer is a linguistic structure. It's born out of language. And as Mundaka Upanishad says, you have avidya and vidya. Avidya is all related to language. We use language to describe materiality. So a computer with trillions of neurons will not be oath-proth with consciousness. For that, we always need an outside agent. So all the patterns that the computers are able to process, computers themselves cannot recognize them, cannot speak about them. They can only speak about, they can only do it as a part of a language. Now, of course, you might say, but can't we have language at different levels? And that is certainly true. That's a wonderful point, that you can program a computer to write poetry and then have another program to look at this poetry and do it at another level, which is deeper. And perhaps in many ways, that's what human beings do. Most of what we do is machine like, including our literary output. You look at country music, you'll see that the same tropes are repeated, and after some point you get tired. Or you can even look at ghazals. There's some beautiful stuff in ghazals, but then you can see, well, okay, it's the same thing being said again and again. Now let's go on to something else. So in some sense, this is probably a very pessimistic and sad aspect of reality. This is that yama part of it, that on one side, beautiful, we are creating reality, but on the other side, this sense that it really amounts to nothing, because it is language description at different levels of abstraction. And to that extent, yes, computers will come more and more into what are the creative domains. And in some sense, that is what has happened sadly in Bollywood. See, in Bollywood, what they have done is they've used kind of machine like views. Okay, now what movie outlines shall we steal from the West and then make it into our own? Or if it was done in the past, or it was done in some other cinema. But after some point, it loses all creativity. Creativity is something where consciousness must recharge it, and that's why it's always new. That's why it's also said, and I mentioned this in my essay on the Devi, that the power of the Devi ultimately manifests itself or projects itself through beauty of different kinds. And beauty is where, and there is a certain statement in Sanskrit that what is beautiful is always new. If it's something which is stuck in an old way, which is what a computer does, then it's not beautiful anymore. So ultimately, the drive for meaning comes out of beauty. And that is why, some people have called it aesthetic Vedanta, or that's why the emphasis on beauty within the Vedic tradition.
Now, when a human being is born, it's equipped with a brain, a blank slate, so to say. But a consciousness attaches itself to this particular piece of hardware. Why doesn't a consciousness attach itself with a computer?
No, the brain is. It's not. I'm not saying that the moment you're born, you're also born in the womb itself. When the foal drops from the uterus of the horse, the moment it drops, it's able to run. So the structures are already there, equipped.
Yes.
So consciousness is not something outside of physical reality. It's always a part of it, but it expresses itself through the brains. And in fact, as you know, in neuroscience, you made this point that that we are learning, but there's also this result that in a certain sense, what happens as we grow is that connections are getting lost. Learning is losing connectivity within the brain, which is why after puberty, for example, it becomes harder to learn certain things, because more and more things have become hardened, so to speak. So there is much more potential in the newborn. But to the question, why doesn't consciousness express itself through the rock? Well, maybe it's not a valid question at all, because the rock is also a part of all of us. It's a part of our ecosystem. It's like saying, why doesn't consciousness express itself through my thumb or through finger? It is because I'm a part of all of this also. This pinda is also the image of this Brahman. So I'm a part of everything. So this rock is a part of me, which is why some of the greatest teachers, the greatest teacher in life is nature itself, walking in nature, going to all kinds of places, which is why all these temples were at these places, which were, out there, where you were compelled to partake of physical reality in its raw, right? Go to the mountains, go to the Himalayas, go to this forest, go to this or that, which, because there, we are experiencing reality where it's not been separated, because the mind separates us from our true selves. Mind is the problem, although, and it's also the only solution that we have. Mind has made us believe that we are only bodies, but it has also given us the capacity, counterintuitively, paradoxically, to make that leap, so to speak, and to be able to fly and become free. And that is what the process of education, the process of spiritual enlightenment is all about.
Right. So nowadays we are seeing these big leaps in AI, in neural networks, in machine learning. There is this case for strong AI, artificial general intelligence. One of the questions I get almost every day is whether AI can become conscious. And you have clearly shown that AI will not ever become conscious. But what if someone creates an AI that's able to mimic human behavior? The so-called philosophical zombie. It behaves exactly like a human being. It can mimic a human being. Can such an AI be a threat to humans in the future?
In a sense, it already is a
Hmm.
threat, because we human beings um, give authority to computers, to machines, AI in some form. They don't necessarily have to look like a human body, right? Or bureaucracies are like AI. We give power, we cede authority to bureaucracies, because we believe that the bureaucracy also has consciousness. But bureaucracies are dead. It's like what happened during the COVID thing. People were so terrified. Bureaucracy said, now you can't meet with people, or you can't even go out and not be without a mask, even if you are in a forest. People went even to that extreme levels, or people were on Zoom with their masks on, right? So it's a consequence of the idea of separation, which is which is fundamental or foundation on which Western binary approach to reality is based on. Separation of God and man, or moment and kafir, or material and non-material, right? So these are all binary categories. Reality, and again we come back to e-dimensionality, is not binary. Our self is not binary, but we are prepared to cede authority, because we believe that others are like this as well. So if the bureaucracy is telling us, we are prepared to. There are some people who have still not left their apartments because they're so terrified of COVID, right? So I think what happens is that humans are very easily uh, tempted to latch on to narratives and cede authority, to become like animals. There is this beautiful line in the Rig Veda which says there are two kinds of animal, Dvipada and Chatushpada, bipeds and quadrupeds. And humans are also animals. It says humans, because humans are Dvipadas, right? They bipeds. So our normal state of humans in society and within themselves is that of a biped animal. So we crave to get connected to stories which then take charge of us, right? It's like um, dogs in dog shops. If they are in crates and you pass by them, and each dog will put their eyes into your eyes and ask to be adopted, to be taken to their homes. You know, Humans are exactly like this. We want to be connected to stories. So if you are unfortunate to be raised in a society where the stories uh, convert you into a monster, you'll be quite happy to become a monster. This is what explains history. This explains even contemporary history. Why are there societies where people are being treated so horribly? You know, you look at Afghanistan, you look at what ISIS did to Yazidis. You know, there were these girls who were raped day in and day out. Why? These humans potentially were exactly like you and me. But humans, this is one aspect of reality. Humans want to be connected to stories. Stories have tremendous power. So what sadly is happening in modern world is that the media is pushing these stories of machine like us, and we are latching onto it, which is why in the West, perfectly reasonable people, beautiful children, once they go to school and college, once they have been indoctrinated into these stories, are prepared to do horrible things to themselves and to everybody else, and to disallow any questioning of what they think the truth is. So freedom is something very fragile, and now more than ever before is that time of danger, because we have entered into this age of machines, and machines surround us everywhere. And we are now insisting on being treated like machines. And in some sense, that is inevitable, because we don't need 8 billion people to do all the stuff that is supposed to be needed. Perhaps we need only a billion. So there will be a shedding of population. Will it be done like in a top-down way, using interventions which are oppressive, or will it be done in a more humane way, where people get a possibility, an opportunity to discover their true self, and every human being discovers they are really wonderful. You know, this consciousness is something so magnificent, and it's a world is as beautiful. This inner world is as beautiful as the outer world. So this is the challenge that is facing the world. And I'm not quite sure that everybody in the world recognizes it, because most people are connected. They are invested in stories which limits them, which makes them the instruments of these stories. It's a kind of a asuric time. Uh, we are in this golden Lanka, and they're fighting. They're fighting over resources of Russia. Okay, Russia should be broken up. So this is a kind of a game, a monopoly game being played now. Hey, Russia is big, and the Russians are only in the western part. So how can we break it up? How can we mine lithium? How can we do this? So this is another big story, or how do we do crypto? How do we sell this? How do we become rich? It's something that one can be amused by. One can laugh observing all this and seeing how the world actually works.
Right. Now the audience has asked a number of questions. Before I take a few of those, I would like to ask you, what else are you working on right now? What can we expect? What kind of research papers can we expect from you in the coming months?
I have several papers on e-dimensionality and AI and applications to DNA and so on. But I also have a book coming out called The Idea of
Ah,
India, where, in addition to going back to Sanskrit sources within India and later Indian sources, I also go to the greater India. Bharat is not just India. Bharat is an idea, which is a universal idea, which is an idea of wisdom. Bharat, Bha meaning light, um, and Rat meaning absorbed in wisdom. Anybody who is absorbed in wisdom is a Bharatiya. But to be more specific, the stuff that I have worked on Central Asia, Khotan, on Kucha, the Tokharian language, which is really should be called the Kuchian language, the Slavs, the Germans, the East Southeast Asia, all this idea of wisdom, universal. Let's not call it Indian. Universal idea, what was its implications, and maybe now that the world is a village once again, perhaps this wisdom will liberate everybody, will liberate, make it possible for everybody um, to realize their potential, because Ishwar is within each human being, irrespective of the community, the jati, the race, the land they come from. So this is what I'm doing, and also, as I told you, continuously writing papers on math and physics, and I don't know where they come from. One morning I wake up and I think I have to write this, and I write it rather in quick time, in a day or two, and then move on to something else.
Right. So let me just take a couple, maybe two or three questions from the audience. One is by, I've got a different screen here, I'm looking there. One is by Himanshu Parashar. He would like to ask you, how can one read or learn Vedanta from the basics to advanced level? Why is it not so accessible like the other Western philosophies as well as Eastern schools of thoughts?
Well, it is. It's accessible. Vedanta is just one line. Vedanta is that there is Atman, there is consciousness, plus there is physical reality. Vedanta, the essence of Vedanta is in the Bhagavad Gita. Or read the Upanishads. They are all free on the internet. So it is accessible. And it's not just language, because ultimately Vedanta is not just the words. It's the experience of all of this. And which is where a lot of the books by Westerners on Vedanta miss it, because they're only looking at the words. It's the experience. But it is there. So just type Vedanta or get a copy of the Bhagavad Gita and read it critically, question every word, and then you get it.
Right. Okay, one more question. Saurabh Bhadoria asks, isn't the consciousness of every individual different in nature? I think you addressed that, right?
One consciousness, different minds, a billion different minds, but one consciousness, because consciousness is the light that falls on our minds. There's only one light.
Right. Let's take maybe one or two more. This is by Pradyumna. Pradyumna asks, what is the purpose of life according to Vedanta?
The purpose of life according to Vedanta is to discover yourself. Quite like what Aristotle said. Not Aristotle, Socrates. An unexamined life is not worth not having. If you haven't examined yourself, then maybe your life is not worth living, something like that. So the purpose of life is to discover, to take delight in the beauty of our own nature, is to find joy, ananda. Joy in this sense, ananda in the sense of discovering the beauty of this transcendent self that we are.
Right. Okay, I think we'll stop there. So, Dr. Kak, thank you so much. Wonderful talking to you. You are doing incredible work, and please keep going, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, Abhijit. Really enjoyed it.